At 5:18 p.m., Claire Whitmore, the cold CEO, walked onto the workshop floor, her expression a mask of severe disapproval. She stopped before Ethan Cole, 40, a single father and mechanic, his hands thick with engine grease. Claire pointed to her report. "Your delay is unacceptable. You're terminated." Younger engineers exchanged smug glances. Ethan silently removed his gloves and nodded once. His 6-year-old daughter, Lily, sitting nearby, ran to him. "Daddy, are we going home now?" He ruffled her hair. "Yes, sweetie." As they walked toward the exit, the ground began to tremble faintly. No one knew Ethan's secret name was about to be shouted from the sky. Ethan Cole was, by all technical accounts, one of the most capable and irreplaceable mechanics Apex Aeronautics had ever hired. His resume was a masterpiece of understatement, yet he was only ever granted short-term, renewable contracts continually flagged in the HR system due to his unclear background. He had simply listed his previous employment as government contracts, highly technical field operations. He refused to elaborate, offering only a vague smile when pressed by the corporate recruiters. Ethan's sole immovable demand was to work the late shift, from noon until 5 p.m. This precisely timed schedule allowed him to manage Lily's school pickup and drop-off schedule, a devotion Claire Whitmore viewed as a critical and professional flaw, branding him in her internal notes as lacking full corporate commitment and scalability. Claire's corporate doctrine was a belief system built on ruthless efficiency. For her, emotion and family life were not supportive pillars. They were liabilities that inevitably degraded professional focus and efficiency. She managed her company through cold, hard performance metrics and absolute suffocating control. She believed that any attachment outside the corporate mission was a weakness to be exploited or eliminated. She had never once stopped to ask Ethan why he consistently refused offers for managerial promotion, which would have meant a 6-figure salary but demanded 12-hour unpredictable days. He preferred the simple physical labor where the output was immediate and undeniable, where a fixed engine was a fixed engine, allowing him to be home for Lily's bedtime stories and homework. That day, the atmosphere was particularly charged. Claire was under immense pressure from the board to cut costs and demonstrate maximum control. Today's termination was not about mitigating risk. It was a brutal, calculated power move. A tiny, complex, custom-fabricated fuel pump component, scheduled for final assembly at 5:01 p.m., had been delayed by an hour and 45 minutes. The delay was logistical, caused by an external vendor, but Claire needed a scapegoat. She decided to make an instant public example of the single dad mechanic, ensuring the message of absolute compliance filtered down through the entire engineering floor. She held the report like a weapon. "Mr. Cole," Claire stated, her voice sharp and utterly devoid of warmth, echoing across the silent workshop floor. "We have established that the assembly line was forced to halt due to the delay in your final inspection protocol. You understand that we maintain a zero-tolerance policy for schedule breaches. You are dismissed immediately." Ethan stood tall, meeting her gaze calmly, his eyes reflecting the harsh industrial lights. He didn't argue. He didn't offer the easily available excuse of the late delivery. He merely requested, in a deep, steady tone that held no tremor of fear or subservience, "I understand the terms, Miss Whitmore. Could I please receive my final pay for the hours worked today?" Claire's jaw tightened. She prided herself on being tough, not flexible. She saw his quiet request as a final attempt to negotiate. "Breach of progress means there are no exceptions to the contract terms, Mr. Cole. You will receive your final check, minus today's labor, upon official processing. The contract termination is effective immediately." The injustice of denying him 2 hours of earned wages settled in the air like a quiet, cold weight. Ethan felt his daughter's small hand slip into his. Lily was pressed tightly against his leg, her head hidden behind his work-worn jeans. She didn't cry, but the visible tremor in her tiny grip was enough. Ethan gently squeezed her hand, giving Claire one last, meaningful look. A look not of anger or resentment, but one of deep, abiding disappointment in her character. "Understood." He turned away from the CEO, dismissing her and her power completely. He guided Lily out of the brightly lit, humming workshop and into the harsh, cold afternoon wind of the old asphalt parking lot. The air was frigid. The asphalt was already frosting over with the evening chill. Lily looked up at her father, her small face serious and worried. "Are you sad, Daddy? Is it bad that we don't have that job anymore?" Ethan knelt, pulling her close into the unique, oil-scented safety of his thick, worn coat. He held her tight, a rock of certainty. "I am sad," he admitted softly, "because you had to watch that, sweetie. Never forget how someone treats you when they have total power over you. Kindness is the only currency that matters." Then he stood and looked up. He lifted his head to the vast, empty sky, a landscape of endless blue and gray where he once controlled the narrative. It was the only place he truly belonged. The cold, empty space seemed to mirror the hollow ache of his necessary exile. In the inner pocket of his jacket, he instinctively touched a small, old, scratched piece of metal. A military-issue dog tag he hadn't worn around his neck in years. A relic of a life he had intentionally silenced. As they reached his reliable, aging sedan, a car whose maintenance was always prioritized over his new clothes, a sound began to cut through the stillness of the evening air. It was faint at first, a distant, rhythmic thrumming, the sound of heavy rotor blades. Back inside the Apex Aeronautics workshop, the sound grew from a faint, localized thrum into a distinct, low roar that vibrated through the floor plates. Workers near the massive overhead doors began to crane their necks, their initial boredom replaced by professional curiosity. "Must be the usual Air Force exercise," joked one young engineer, shrugging, trying to sound nonchalant as he stacked toolboxes. "They love to buzz the commercial sectors when they get bored." Claire Whitmore, still standing rigidly near the exit, frowned deeply. She checked the digital flight log on her highly specialized wrist tablet. "There is no scheduled air traffic in this corridor," she muttered, annoyed by the unexpected deviation from her rigidly controlled environment. "Definitely no authorized flight path. I'll call the tower immediately." Before she could lift her phone, the sound became overwhelming. It was a physical assault. The low, deep whop, whop, whop of massive, churning rotors dominated everything. Then a massive dark gray Navy helicopter, bearing the sharp, distinctive insignia of a specialized search and rescue and operations air fleet, a machine known only by its capability, not its common use, appeared low and terrifyingly fast over the distant tree line. It was an unmistakable machine of serious, non-negotiable government intent. The wind generated by the approaching aircraft instantly became a furious, palpable physical force. It tore through the large open doors, slamming them half closed, scattering dust, loose paperwork, and even light tools across the polished hangar floor. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, struggling against the sudden power drain. The chopper didn't merely pass over, it descended. With breathtaking speed, precision, and a thunderous roar, the pilot lowered the enormous machine right onto the empty asphalt space directly in front of the Apex Aeronautics building, the very spot where Ethan's old sedan was parked. Outside, Lily screamed, terrified, clapping her hands over her ears against the deafening, bone-rattling noise. Ethan instantly pulled her into a tight, protective embrace, turning his back to the raging wind and dust cloud. He shielded her completely, his body a solid barrier against the sudden, violent chaos. He squinted at the massive machine, his military-trained eyes immediately identifying the specific model and the specialized antennae. "They shouldn't be here. Not for me." The instant the skids touched the ground, sending a shockwave through the air, the helicopter's large side hatch was thrown open. A figure emerged quickly. It was a man in full immaculate Navy dress uniform, a high-ranking flag officer whose demeanor radiated urgency, discipline, and absolute authority. His eyes, sharp and intense, swept quickly over the immediate area, ignoring the astonished, terrified onlookers clustered at the hangar entrance. The officer raised a military-grade, noise-canceling microphone to his mouth, his voice amplified to cut through the ferocious din of the rotors. He didn't speak a name from a personnel file. He shouted a title, a rank, a code that only a few thousand people on the planet would recognize. The words were precise, demanding, and utterly foreign to the regulated, metric-driven world of Apex Aeronautics. Apex Field Command, this is U.S. Navy. I repeat, Commander Cole, do you copy? The entire workshop went silent. The moment the rotors began to slow, the silence was immediate and profound. Every head, the engineers, the janitors, the security guards, turned instantly toward the single father standing alone in the parking lot. Every movement ceased. The group of young engineers who had been mocking Ethan's termination moments earlier stood utterly, physically frozen, their smug expressions wiped clean by sudden, bewildering terror. Claire Whitmore, standing near the hangar door, felt the blood drain from her face. She stumbled back a step, her high heels scraping on the concrete. Commander Cole, that title, that rank. It didn't match the bland, single-line contract mechanic name on her HR report. It didn't match anything she had authorized. It was a complete, hostile intrusion into her controlled reality. Lily, still trembling slightly from the wind, tilted her head back, looking up at her father. Her small face was a mixture of fear and profound, sudden awe. She knew her dad was strong, but this was a power she had never witnessed. Ethan didn't move for a long moment. He kept his arm around his daughter, waiting until the officer's eyes, sharp and demanding, finally met his. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling a long, deep breath, the final separation from the protective, anonymous life he had chosen. He let the air out slowly, accepting the end of his disguise. He looked directly at the officer, his eyes meeting the challenge. Then he released Lily, stepped one decisive, final pace forward out of the shadow of the chopper. His voice, now low, gravelly, and carrying the weight of command, was perfectly audible even over the remaining rotor whine. "I'm here." The naval officer immediately snapped into a rigid, textbook military salute, a salute so precise it could shatter glass. It was a gesture of respect, deference, and absolute necessity that stunned every single observer into complete, absolute silence. The entire workshop was locked in a deep collective freeze. Their terminated mechanic, the man labeled lacking corporate commitment, was now being saluted by a high-ranking officer of the United States Navy. Claire Whitmore's carefully constructed professional facade finally shattered. Her voice caught in her throat. She stammered, pointing a trembling hand at Ethan, her carefully modulated pitch failing completely. He is only a contract mechanic, an hourly worker. This is an intrusion on private property." The officer did not even spare her a glance. He held his salute until Ethan acknowledged it. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, sharp, and utterly dismissive of the CEO's desperate status grab. "No, ma'am. That is former Naval Air Maintenance Commander Ethan Cole. He is, simply put, the best field troubleshooter the Navy has ever produced. He is an essential asset." Ethan calmly returned the salute, his eyes conveying a quiet acceptance of his identity being brutally and publicly exposed. He didn't revel in it. He simply submitted to his duty. Freeze moment. The urgent operational recall name. The officer lowered his hand, his expression turning grave and urgent. He spoke clearly, ensuring the serious nature of the moment resonated through the stunned crowd. "Commander Cole, we need you on board immediately. A specialized strike squadron, the new Phoenix assets, has reported a catastrophic, total systems failure in flight over hostile territory. Their emergency maintenance protocols are failing. The component that failed is one you personally designed the complex fail-safes for. You are the only person alive who can talk them through the deep, manual override procedures." Claire took an involuntary step back, physically recoiling. Her multi-million-dollar acquisitions, her quarterly profit goals, and her absolute corporate authority suddenly felt frivolous and utterly meaningless in the face of this genuine, imminent, life-and-death crisis. Ethan knelt immediately, his focus solely on his daughter. The noise of the idling chopper was a low threat, but his voice was calm and clear. He pulled her close, his eyes full of love and a gentle, profound apology for leaving her. "Daddy has to go help some people right now, Lily. They are very high up in the sky, and they need me to fix something very important." You stay here with the people from my old job, okay? Lily, though tears were streaming down her face, nodded bravely, clutching his coat. Promise, Daddy. Promise you'll come back safe, Dad. Ethan pressed his forehead to hers for one final, precious second. Always. Before Claire could utter another word, Ethan was gone. He climbed rapidly into the humming, waiting helicopter. He didn't look back. Moments later, the massive aircraft lifted off, kicking up a final, powerful blast of wind and dust before banking sharply and vanishing into the fading evening light, heading east toward the crisis zone. The stunned silence inside Apex Aeronautics lasted only a minute before it was replaced by pure, logistical chaos. Frantic updates began circulating back through the secure channels. Claire's phone began to ring incessantly. The final, decisive one was from the chairman of the board himself, his voice laced with pure, unadulterated panic and fury. Claire, what in God's name did you just do? Do you have any idea who you just fired? The Navy is demanding to know why their primary troubleshooter was denied 2 hours of simple pay. They are threatening to pull all future contracts with Apex. This is a systemic failure, Claire. Fix it. Claire retreated to her office, locking the door. She looked out the window at the empty stretch of asphalt, the dust still settling. Her worldview, rigid and absolute, was collapsing. He chose his daughter over a promotion. He chose anonymity over status. He chose human life over 2 hours of pay. The cold metrics of her life seemed ridiculous, cheapened by the sheer magnitude of Ethan's sacrifice and skill. The silence of the empty office was deafening, forcing her to confront the absolute void in her own existence. A life defined by numbers that offered no warmth, no loyalty, and no purpose outside of accumulation. She realized her entire corporate philosophy had failed a fundamental stress test, the value of a human being. The thought that she had tried to diminish a man who was actively saving lives over a minor logistical error was a searing indictment of her entire career. Meanwhile, high above, Ethan worked with brutal, focused efficiency. He wasn't simply following a manual, he was consulting his own memory banks. He bypassed corrupted systems, utilizing the exact technical skill he used to diagnose a faulty pump on the ground. Only this time the stakes were human lives and millions of dollars of state assets. Inside the distressed cockpit, Lieutenant Commander Harris, his face slick with panic sweat, barked into the mic. We've lost primary hydraulics, Commander. We're running on fumes and prayer. The manual override isn't recognizing the failsafe code. Ethan's voice, transmitted from the distant helicopter, was a rock of steady calm against the storm of the emergency. Pilot, listen closely. Ignore the primary display. I need you to locate the J4 harness junction box. It's under the main console, near the secondary power coupling. You have a 10-gauge wire braided blue. Cut it now. You're bypassing the original lock mechanism I designed years ago. It won't be in the manual. Harris hesitated for a split second. Then the sound of tearing metal and a relieved oath crackled through the comms. Ethan continued. Now reroute power using the emergency bus bar. That should give you just enough juice to recycle the fuel manifold. Don't waste a second. He spoke in rapid, calm, highly complex technical language into the radio, guiding two frightened pilots through a manual reboot sequence that bypassed the original failed system, a fix he had engineered a decade prior. An hour later, the news was official, broadcast across military airwaves and then through the panicked corporate channels. The crippled squadron had been successfully repaired in midair and safely recovered. There were 0 casualties. The official on-site command broadcast a single, stark, irrefutable statement. If not for the instantaneous, field-level response and expert technical assistance of Commander Cole, the resulting casualties and loss of state assets would have been catastrophic and unimaginable. Just as the sun dipped completely below the horizon, bathing the industrial landscape in a somber purple and orange glow, the gray Navy helicopter returned, descending slowly and deliberately. It landed with the same forceful precision. Ethan stepped out. He was still wearing his slightly grease-stained mechanic's shirt, but the wind caught his coat, making him look less like a former employee and more like the hero of an impossible mission. He carried no briefcase, no phone, only the quiet competence of a man who had stared down death and won. Claire Whitmore emerged from the building, walking slowly across the cooling asphalt. She stood perfectly still, watching him. She had faced hostile takeovers, global market crashes, and vicious corporate betrayals, but this was the first time in her life she had truly and deeply frozen in shock, paralyzed not by fear of loss, but by the shattering realization of her own moral bankruptcy. The remaining workers gave Ethan a wide berth, their respect now absolute. Ethan walked toward his daughter and lifted her into a fierce, relieved hug. Only when Lily was safely in his arms did he turn to face Claire. Claire finally approached him, her composure visibly shattered, her tailored clothes looking ridiculous in the fading light. Her usual cold confidence was replaced by a look of profound, genuine shame. Her voice was barely a whisper, betraying a slight tremor. "Ethan, Commander Cole, I was wrong. I let the pressure and the metrics blind me to what truly matters. I treated you like a replaceable part, when you are clearly the whole engine." She took a deep breath, trying desperately to regain her footing, to frame the situation in corporate terms she understood. "I am offering you immediate reinstatement, with full back pay for the hours denied, and an executive salary, triple your former rate. I will give you a place on the board. Name your price. We need your institutional knowledge. Apex needs you." Ethan listened patiently, allowing her to finish her frantic offer. He gently shook his head, the simple, quiet movement devastating her desperate attempt at control. "It's too late for a triple salary to fix the cost of dignity, Ms. Whitmore." He paused, letting the finality of his decision sink in. "I appreciate the offer, truly, but I won't return to a place that views the stability of a child's life as a liability and views family commitment as an inconvenience. Apex Aeronautics requires you to sell your soul for success. I found a better buyer for my time. My commitment is not to the metric, it is to the human." Claire fell silent, her expensive shoes still standing on the dirt-stained hangar floor. She stood there for a very long minute, finally understanding the depth of her error, not just professional, but moral. The man she had dismissed was a genuine hero. She was merely a wealthy administrator. She looked away from Ethan and toward Lily, who was clutching her father's hand, her eyes large, tear-stained, and deeply watchful. Claire swallowed her pride, knelt down to be at the child's level, an unprecedented gesture for the CEO. "Lily," she said softly, reaching out a hesitant hand, "I am truly sorry. I behaved badly toward your father. He is a good man." Lily, quiet and steady, simply looked at the woman who had hurt her dad and said nothing. She didn't glare, nor did she smile. Her gaze was just purely honest, a clear 6-year-old mirror reflecting the coldness Claire had projected. Claire held the child's gaze, unable to look away, seeing in Lily's eyes the judgment of innocence. The child's silence was heavier than any boardroom reprimand she had ever received. Lily leaned against Ethan, a silent declaration of absolute loyalty that was more damning than any public accusation. It was a tangible physical representation of the human commitment that Claire had spent a decade rejecting. The naval officer stepped forward, a folder in his hands. He offered Ethan a new, permanent position, lead technical field consultant for naval aviation. The conditions negotiated while Ethan was in the air were unheard of. Absolute flexibility, work from home when possible, and family time always explicitly prioritized. Ethan accepted the offer immediately, shaking the officer's hand in a gesture of mutual professional respect. That night, Claire Whitmore didn't go home to her luxurious empty apartment. She stayed in her office until dawn, rewriting Apex Aeronautics' entire personnel policy. The new core value, written in her own hand and stamped into the company charter, was humanity and commitment over hours. Machetwam. Over the next few days, several employees, including the young engineers who had mocked him, quietly approached Ethan's empty workstation, leaving handwritten notes of apology. Ethan's parting message, delivered to the entire workshop through the officer, was always the same, delivered with a gentle sincerity that cut deeper than any anger. "Don't apologize to me. Just be kind to the next person who asks for time off to take care of their family." Claire stood alone on the company's highest balcony, watching a private car, paid for by her, drive Ethan and Lily away. Her eyes were red, not from the exhaustion of her job, but from the sudden, stark, and painful realization of her own lonely, mismanaged life. Weeks later, a quiet, reassuring routine settled over Ethan and Lily. Ethan worked part-time as the Navy's lead technical consultant, splitting his hours between sophisticated home diagnostic tools and occasional, non-critical field deployment. The work was demanding and vital, but the hours were his own. Every morning he walked Lily to her elementary school, not rushing, just taking the time to talk about her dreams and her homework. Lily, utterly proud of her father, the man who could fix things even when they are flying, often showed her friends a perfectly folded, intricate paper model of a gray helicopter, a gift from her father's old Navy crew. Ethan still wore his old, comfortable, grease-stained mechanic's shirt when he was at home. It was the uniform of his choice, the one he earned every day through honest, physical work and presence. He didn't need the starched military uniform to feel powerful. His power was his choice to be present. One evening, while reading together on the sofa, Lily looked up from her book, her mind clearly elsewhere. "Daddy," she asked, her voice small and curious, "are you really a commander? Like in charge of everything?" Ethan smiled, kissing the top of her head. "To the Navy, maybe. That's an old title, sweetie. But to you, I'm just Dad. That's the only title I want." Lily snuggled back into his arm, accepting the answer as absolute truth. A few days later, Claire Whitmore sent Ethan a brief, formal email, not from the company address, but from a private account. It expressed deep gratitude for his unexpected service and offered a final, professional apology for the initial termination. Her email signature was conspicuously plain, containing only her name, no title, no corporate logo. Ethan read it, appreciated the effort and the subtle change in tone, and did not reply. The message was sent, the lesson learned. On the shelf above his new clean workbench, now used for Lily's science projects, the old metal dog tag was placed neatly. It was no longer hidden, but displayed as a quiet, powerful testament to his past, fully reconciled with his purposeful present. Outside their window, a distant helicopter sound faded softly into the gentle winter sunset. It was a familiar, comforting sound now, the background noise of a world he continued to protect. Lily leaned her head against her father's shoulder, utterly content and safe. "I'm proud of you, Dad." Ethan wrapped his arm around her tightly, his eyes distant but peaceful. He looked at her, the only metric that ever mattered. "I'm proud of you too, sweetie. Now, where were we on those planets? If you believe stories about genuine integrity, unexpected heroism, and the true cost of dignity deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to TT Healing Tales. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.